FBI oversight since 2019. And next month, the first Department of Homeland Security oversight hearing since January 2018. Today, we're holding the first Department of Justice oversight hearing since October 18th, 2017. That was the only time during the 4-year Trump administration this committee held an agency-wide Department of Justice oversight hearing. Annual oversight hearings were the norm under the Obama administration. I'm pleased to restore this tradition. I thank Attorney General Garland for appearing today. You were confirmed by the Senate in March on a bipartisan basis and took the helm of the Justice Department at a precarious moment. Under Attorney General Barr and his predecessors, the department often played the role of President Trump's personal law firm. Time and again, Trump appointees overrode the professional judgment of the department's nonpartisan career attorneys to advance the president's agenda. Their efforts took a dark and dangerous turn in the waning months of the Trump term, when DOJ political appointees aided President Trump's big lie efforts to challenge the integrity of our election. First, Attorney General Barr cast aside decades-old policy designed to prevent the department from impacting elections. He directed U.S. attorneys and the FBI to investigate the election fraud claims of, nonetheless, Rudy Giuliani, after these claims had been summarily discredited and disproven by countless state election officials. And Barr repeatedly, publicly, and baselessly claimed that mail voting would be rampant to fraud, a charge he himself rejected when the votes were actually counted. After he lost the 2020 election, President Trump found another Justice Department ally in Jeffrey Clark, a mid-level political appointee who became the president's big lie lawyer. Clark pushed the Department of Justice leaders to overturn the election, and when they refused, he plotted with President Trump to replace them. Trump and Clark brought the department to the brink and were thwarted only after the threat of mass resignations across the Department of Justice. I commend those Department of Justice attorneys, many of whom were Trump appointees, who at that critical moment in history resisted President Trump and his plot to attack our democracy. The events this committee described in our recent Subverting Justice report were among the most brazen examples of President Trump attempting to bend the Department of Justice to his will and his agenda. But they were the natural culmination of 4 years of attacks on the Department of Justice. There is a straight line from these events to the violent insurrection in the Capitol building on January 6th, when Trump and his allies could not prevail in court and lost case after case after case claiming voter fraud. They took their big lie to the Justice Department, and when they didn't prevail there, they dispatched an angry mob to storm the Capitol to stop us from counting the electoral votes. I commend the many agents and prosecutors who were working day in and day out to bring these violent insurrectionists to justice. I hope the department will be just as steadfast in pursuit of those who encouraged and incited the attack, and those who would prevent the American people and their representatives from uncovering the truth. I am sorry that the Republican Senate leader refused to join the bipartisan commission that was proposed to investigate the January 6th insurrection attack. I look forward to hearing from the Attorney General this morning about the work that is underway to combat the growing threat of domestic violent extremism. The department cooperated with our committee's investigation into the Jeffrey Clark scheme, and it deserves credit for doing so. Over the course of several months, the department provided documents, authorized testimony, and resolved executive privilege issues, enabling us to uncover, on a bipartisan basis, I might add, just how close we came to a full-blown constitutional crisis. Attorney General Garland, when you appeared before us in February, you acknowledged, and I quote, "great respect for belief in the oversight role of the committee." And you committed your department to, quote, be as responsive as we possibly can to comply with information requests. I commend you for the steps you've taken, but I believe I speak for all of my colleagues in saying there is still room for improvement when it comes to department responses. And the department must deliver on its mission to ensure fair and impartial justice. Let me give you an example. In the closing days of the Trump administration, the department's Office of Legal Counsel issued a memo wrongly declaring, in my estimation, that federal inmates released to home confinement under the Bipartisan CARES Act must return to the Federal Bureau of Prisons custody following the COVID-19 emergency. In fact, the CARES Act includes no such requirement. These nonviolent inmates are already home and are overwhelmingly reintegrating into the community with success. On April 23rd, I sent you a letter, joined by Senator Booker, urging you to rescind this memo. 6 months later, we still have not received a response. Another example. In November of 2020, the Trump administration published a rule discouraging inmates from completing programs under the First Step Act to reduce their chances of reoffending. This was a major measure that was undertaken, the First Step Act, by combining a prison reform measure that was co-sponsored by Senator Cornyn and Senator Whitehouse with a sentencing measure co-sponsored by Senator Grassley and myself and signed into law by the President. Now, Senator Grassley and I sent you a letter on May 5th urging the department to reject the proposed rule and instead enact a rule consistent with the goal of the First Step Act of reducing recidivism. It's been 5 months. In fact, more than 5 months. We still haven't received a response. The First Step Act allowed the Bureau of Prisons to grant compassionate release in extraordinary and compelling circumstances, such as a once-in-a-century global pandemic. Under the Trump administration, listen to these numbers. The Bureau of Prisons denied all but 36 of 31,000 compassionate release petitions filed during the pandemic. In the first 6 months of the Biden administration, the Bureau of Prisons approved just 9 compassionate release requests. This is extraordinary. When the infection rate in the Bureau of Prisons was 6 to 7 times the national infection rate and the death rate equally appalling, when compassionate release requests were received, 31,000 of them, only 36 were allowed. Meanwhile, the pandemic has been devastating in our Bureau of Prison facilities. 265 inmates have died, including 6 within the last few weeks. The death of a 42-year-old man in August came after the Department of Justice denied his compassionate release request. Republicans and Democrats worked together to pass the First Step Act, to make our justice system fairer and our community safer. These reforms are only as good as their implementation. Attorney General Garland, as you come before this committee, the right to vote and to have the votes of every American counted is under attack like no time in decades. This year alone, state legislators have introduced more than 425 bills making it more difficult for Americans to vote, particularly people of color. 19 states have enacted 33 of these laws. Some of these laws set new limits on voting by mail. Others cut hours for polling locations. All of them are designed to achieve the same outcome, make it more difficult to vote. At the same time, big lie proponents are pushing new laws to give partisan state legislators the ability to overturn election results they don't agree with. They are ousting local election officials who faithfully apply the law and oversaw an election that Trump's own Department of Homeland Security called the most secure in American history. And their efforts coincide with an unprecedented increase in violent threats towards state and local election officials. I'd like to add at this point about these violent threats. It is rife across America. Those of us who are airline passengers know what the flight attendants are facing with thousands of confrontations, even violent confrontations, over wearing masks on aircraft. I've sent a letter to you, joined by others, saying this has to be taken seriously. These assaults in the so-called name of liberty are unacceptable. And your October 4th memo relative to schools and school board officials and their own peril at this point, I think should be mentioned. I have heard statements from members of this committee which I think are really inconsistent with reality. Those who think the insurrectionist mob of January 6th was merely a group of tourists visiting the Capitol ignore the pillaging, the deaths, and the serious injuries to over 100 law enforcement officials. And those who argue that school board meetings across America are not more dangerous and more violent than in the past are ignoring reality. I went on and just typed in this morning, school board violence. on one of the search engines. Page after page is coming up. In my state of Illinois, Mendon, Illinois, is a small rural town in Adams County, the western part of our state, that I have represented for almost 40 years. It is a quiet, solid community, and yet they had their own instance at a school board meeting where an individual had to be arrested because he had threatened violence against the school board members over masks in schools, for example. That story is repeated over and over again. The state of Minnesota, Senator Klobuchar knows the story well. The state of Idaho. We are seeing violence at these school board meetings in an unprecedented number. I think you made it clear, that, and you don't believe, that we should infringe on free speech. But free speech does not involve threats and violence, period. And we ought to join with local law enforcement officials to protect the school board members who are being intimidated in this way. I want to close by mentioning an issue I said to you personally. I'm honored to represent the city which you grew up in and which I now visit with great frequency, obviously, and that's the city of Chicago. The gun violence situation there is intolerable, intolerable. And we're not the only city in America by any means that's facing this. We need to have your assurance that there is a concerted, determined effort to deal with gun violence at the federal level, coordinating our effort with the state and local officials. With that in mind, I hope we can reach some agreement to do so very quickly. And let me hand it off now to the ranking